Hey, deep fried Neurons here. And uh, uploading this episode a little later than I thought I would be, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. You'll still get 4 episodes a month. Mostly the upload regularity will suffer a little bit because of college, but not necessarily. Still, we will survive. I think it won't be the worst thing ever. Today's episode, we have aesthetic, and I did want to get into vaporwave, but unfortunately, time did not permit that. Not to mention that the guest I had lined up for a particular discussion about like aesthetic of vaporwave could not make it for reasons that are you know life in general. So that's okay. Shit happens, I guess. So, but Aditi and Himanshi were here, and they were extremely nice to facilitate a discussion about aesthetic, the philosophy, the art, the works. I am not going to waste any more time of yours, and I'm gonna cue the fucking. Yeah, he's here. So that's great. Craig is going to be recording us for today. Also, for people who are listening at home, hi. I'm going to leave this part in just because I know how much it annoys you. So suffer in silence. And today we're with Aditi and Himanshi, and we're talking about aesthetics. Please introduce yourself because I'm horrible at introductions. Aditi, you wanna go first?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Hi, I'm Aditi. I am here on Anuj's podcast for the third time now. Um, okay. I am an art historian. I used to be an architect. I work in cultural administration at Sahapedia in Delhi. I also do a lot of curation, a lot of research, and sometimes I also do design. Uh, yeah, that's who I am.
Himanshi?
Cool. Hi, I'm Himanshi. I am trained as I think a communication designer, but now I work in the space of both design and art, move steering very gently away from trying to steer away from any label when it comes to a graphic designer or a product designer. I'm now in the space of also making sculptures and um, I would say my work doesn't define me as much as my interests in well being and lifestyle, if that makes any sense.
Yep. It makes sense, of course. And Aditi, I think you might be on a list at this point that you're worried about about problem podcasts. It's refer
Oh,
episode 55 for context. Okay, this episode's primary function is to make people listen to older episodes. I just need listen time. Anyway, so today we're talking about aesthetic broadly. For after that, I just want to jump right into it. Like I want to start discussing through history. Now, this is the area of aesthetics that I'm the weakest at. And wait, before we get to history, we should know why this episode is happening altogether. Um, there's a meme going around that I circulated called "Why Banana." And why banana reminded me of the artistic piece that went for how many millions? Does anybody know the actual number by any chance?
A lot, a lot.
A
Let's
lot.
just leave it there.
Um, More than my left kidney, basically. And that piece is why I thought, what makes anything appealing at all? And that's why we went into this episode, and I got two extremely knowledgeable people about aesthetic to talk about it, so that I don't have to do my homework. And so that's why I want to get into the history of it, because I sort of want to understand why structured thought about how visuals communicate sort of came from. I know it started in ancient Greece because there's no structured thought records anywhere else that I'm aware of. I know Aristotle's school started that, and most of it was essentialist communication, which is sort of to document history or to express um, very particular emotion. And this is because Aristotle wasn't exactly a pro art person. even though he had sculptures built of himself so that people remember him. Sorry, I'm just salty. So from from here, I just want to know what are the Indian parallels to it, and how exactly are have we reached to somebody from an essentialist like um, Plato and Aristotle, who only believe in essence of art, to complete anti-essentialists like Wittgenstein, who say everything is art as long as it relates to something or is peculiarly um, a ritual is the word he used, but that's not the only word he uses. And then I want to expand it to language and uh, general conductance of people.
I think
Um,
Aditi would be a better bet.
I'm not so okay. First things first. History of aesthetics is a full, like, people think it's a subset of history of art, but it is not. It is a whole other sort of field in itself. So generally, you have to go way back to dive into history of aesthetics, because history of aesthetics is essentially linked more with philosophy than with what we
Mhm.
understand aesthetics as today, which is visual arts. And if you've ever sort of, so my understanding of aesthetics, my sort of study of aesthetics started and ended with Foucault, because that's what I was taught in school. Um, so my understanding of it is very sort of the aesthetics of existence, as he put it. So history of aesthetics internationally is, I would call it, as a field of philosophy more than a field of visual art or design, which sort of eventually evolved and sort of became something that we understand as design and art right now. What Anuj said is completely true. The first sort of, I think it was something somewhere around 1700s where it was first sort of used in the way we understand it right now. Um, and then eventually people sort of evolved it to a certain point. There's also a lot of influence of like a Victorian understanding of what is art, and then associating that with aesthetics and things like that. How sort of dance, music, and language was sort of associated with it, and then removed from it, and then reassociated with things like that. Uh, in terms of the Indian context, so I'm not the best person to talk about this because I studied history of art in the West. So all I know about sort of the Indian sort of history of aesthetic or history of art comes from what I've read after, just like on my own. But the way it is understood is that, again, it's a more philosophical thing. There's a lot of religion sort of attached to it. There's a lot of utility attached to it, because if you look back in sort of in the history of art, there's a lot of, we will make objects that are beautiful, because beauty is sort of using a certain thing. Like if you think about objects of beauty or things of beauty from the Indian context, you could think of like extremely good design, great music, sort of feat in literature, feat in dance, things like that. But then that sort of like morphed a little when we have the British walk in, and then again, like, the idea of high art and low art walks in, and then schools are established, and sort of the study of art becomes more streamlined, which means the British can actually teach you what aesthetic means and what art means, which they did by specifically teaching you Western sort of. They would rather teach you a Renoir than your own sort of contemporary. And then there was sort of resistance to that, like there always is. There was establishment of different schools, which came from within, like which came from India, and then it eventually started becoming towards, like, I would say 60s. Maybe someone can correct me if I'm wrong. I'm bad at these dates. Around 60s, when it actually became like you could see that these are the schools, these are the form of like aesthetics that they teach and they follow, and that also came from a certain type of philosophy. Like if I am an artist coming from Shantiniketan, that philosophy is sort of, so it did a whole full circle around here, is how I look at it. Where it started from philosophy, in between it sort of became something that was more visual, and then with the establishment of these rebel schools, or whatever else you would like to call it, it became a philosophy in itself, which had visual representations apart from other forms of representations as well.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's about it. Yeah.
I just wanted to, building on your point on that Anuj said earlier, that generally when we look at the start of aesthetic, it's either has a religious or a political connotation. So when it came to the Indian history, it keeps drawing me back to like Ashoka's pillars and stuff, and how it initially, to spread Buddhism, he would set up these sort of pillars as communication mediums. So it was actually communication design that had to be done aesthetically to spread religious,
Mhm.
uh,
Right.
and it was also
Yeah.
so much about, like, I keep thinking about the caveman scriptures or Egyptian drawings on papyrus,
Mm.
that kind of stuff started as an expression, I think, as an expression of trying to understand life in itself.
Right. So
And
yes, yeah. So I agree, but like along with that, there is an element of, like, of course, communication over there, which is very very important and should not be looked over. But along with that, there is also, like, say for example, there is this whole idea of aesthetic in chants, or aesthetic in poetry, or aesthetic in prose and things like that, which sort of came from I know that there is a word for this in Sanskrit, but I'm blanking out right now. I cannot remember it right now. But it is associated with, like, a much deeper sort of, like, not just visual communication, right? So like all forms of communication is sort of
yeah,
associated with, whether it is verbal or
maybe
visual
that's a
or
good,
performance. Yeah.
I agree. I think maybe that's a good diversion into trying to inquire into what is aesthetic to begin with.
Hmm.
Because when most
Uh,
people think of aesthetic, I don't know, can we do this?
yeah, sure, sure. I mean, to be honest, the entire point of this podcast is start from the definition and end up in wherever you want to go. To be honest, Oregon, if that's what we end up talking about, I'm fine with that. Uh, so my understanding so far was aesthetic is the study of what art says, along with um, what a visual communicates to you as a human experience. I mean,
Right.
that's where I came from into this podcast, but it's open to like debate or whatever.
So just sorry, Aditi, I know you wanted to say something, but I just wanted to
No.
ask him
Yeah, go ahead.
and you. I wanted to ask both of you: is when you say visual, are you thinking that aesthetic is just connected to one sense, as in eyes?
So I'm talking about this in terms of epistemology. um, the way modern sort of academicians or researchers or writers use the term aesthetics is mostly visual, and it is a form of writing. So like when I'm writing about, when say I as a writer write about a certain piece, I could write about it aesthetically, or I could write about it from a visual culture perspective, or there are other perspectives also, but there's a very specific perspective that the word aesthetic
Aesthetic.
comes with when it comes to, like, and this comes from academia, like academia sort of teaches you how to sort of write in
Hmm.
this particular way, how to look at. So if I'm looking at a painting and I'm nitpicking every little sort of detail of it, and I'm trying to look for connotations for every little bit of it, I'm looking at the painting's aesthetics, because I'm
Hmm.
looking at sort of every little color, every little detail, and trying to figure out what that signifies.
Hmm.
And that is the modern sort of understanding. And from what I understand, the evolution of the word uh, to be used this way started happening in the 1700s. Before that, it was just sort of like this, philosophical ball game that was going on, wherein, yes, Anuj, tell me.
No, I just wanted to weigh into what the Himanshi's question.
Hmm.
Maybe this is because I'm reading Wittgenstein right now, is why it's so influential on me. The reason
Hmm.
I bring up aesthetic as a strictly visual format is that I know that sound has aesthetic. For example, one of the ways to describe Radiohead's music is like that is the aesthetic of an anxious future. Uh, but the reason I say that is because everything in my brain translates from sound, from touch, or taste, or smell into a visual, and then I communicate that visual through meanings I've assigned into words.
Hmm.
So for most people who have visual perception as a sense that works for them in a normal range, I would believe that even when they talk about aesthetic in the non-visual sense, the imagination of it happens purely in visual terms. So for me, aesthetic, as of my understanding currently, has been extremely visual.
Just to weigh in on that exact thing, I have a very dear friend who is not sighted, and he was an
Hmm.
artist. So for him, uh, aesthetic comes from touch fully. His entire derivation of aesthetic is touch based. So every time I used to make one of these sculptures, he would go and, like, for me, it was a test to see whether the communication of the sculpture is happening for him. Because if he can touch it and visualize it, then the role of what this was for is working, you know. And simultaneously, I was drawing up the definition of aesthetic set by our good friend Google. Says that it is concerned with beauty or the appreciation of beauty, regardless of whether it's visual or not.
Hmm.
No, and I'm just debating for debate's sake. Like, does it have to be visual? Is all
No,
I'm.
it is an interesting place to take the discussion into because my understanding of aesthetics so far has been extremely visual.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
uh, if you take out the visual sense, then like of course it sort of topples it on its head because then it becomes spatial and tactile.
Yeah.
So it is an interesting place to take it, and of course if it's sort of because I don't know the experience of not having sight. Uh, I have always imagined things by vision.
Vision. Yeah.
So, but the only place I can relate it to is the what's that video of the AI learning to walk? It sort of
Yeah,
locates
yeah.
its legs and then it understands the terrain by like just touching things because it
Sense,
doesn't have a
yeah.
camera or visual
Hmm.
feedback. So I
Right.
was looking at it as 3D mapping, but even that in my brain doesn't happen without visuals.
Right. So, spatial aesthetic is a whole ball game in itself. Um
Hmm.
like, my understanding of it comes from whatever little practice I did, and comes from sort of, because it is like that experience in itself, like we're talking about experiences right now, that experience in itself is an aesthetic. I don't know how else to put it. Like, spatial experience is an aesthetic, and people do use that. I know people, I know architects, many of the greats have used that as a cornerstone for what you would call impeccable design. Spatial aesthetic is a whole sort of, and I would love to sort of get into it, but it would take up the whole day. But yeah, like you said, it also boils down to, see, I read this somewhere. I don't really remember where. At the end of the day, for an able-bodied person, the sense of sight is something that is sort of the most receptive. So you do boil things down to a sense of vision, and you're sort of more aware of your sense of sight than your say of your tactile sense or your spatial sense, right? Yeah. Yes,
Sorry,
Himanshi,
just to
tell
build
me.
on this before it slips my mind, I had to tell you guys I had read a book called The Brain by Dan Siegel, I think, and
Yeah.
he talks about this, and he talks about if when you have a race, like when you have a running race, there is a reason why a gun has been shot as the signature to start the race instead of a light flashing, because that gun sound reaches you faster and your ears are actually more sensitive, quicker sensitivity than your eyes.
Right, but like quicker sensitivity also means a certain level of. So I really don't remember where I read this, but also means certain level of sort of, because you're grasping everything, you don't really pay attention to it. So just sort of paying more attention to, and that is why sort of I think I read it in Sapiens. I don't remember it, but that is why sort of like the idea of drawing up signs in a cave, or like drawing up is is a thing, is because vision has been sort of, may not be the most sort of may not be the most sensitive sort of senses of them all, but you do depend on it quite a lot. You sort of visualize things, and like, you understand, you don't sort of, at the end of the day, even when you're talking about someone who is sort of visually impaired, you do end up visualizing things.
But
There's this
imagine,
really.
sorry again, before I forget, imagine people who have synesthesia and things like that. Okay, like for
Right.
them, the visual cues becomes equal or perhaps redundant to sounds. And that's pretty
Yeah, yeah,
interesting.
I understand what you're saying completely, but I'm also talking about it the way the word is used. Whenever we're sorting, we never say, like, we rarely say, even you said, you didn't say imagine, you said visualize, as opposed to, because that's how we associate things around us to be. There's this really cool experiment that my mom did. It wasn't called me. Um, she sort of my mom is a neuro-ophthalmologist, which means she works within the spectrum of the nerves and the eyes,
Hmm.
and she essentially, right now, she's a predominant sort of research in is on how to avoid a certain type of blindness, so it's called low vision aids. And as a part of her sort of research, there was an experiment where she sort of looked at. I worked with her on this, and it was really fun. How sort of she looked at certain paintings and sort of boiled down to what like what sort of visual impairity the artist had. So she sort of
Hmm.
boiled it down to how, oh, Van Gogh may have cataract at one point, hence certain kind of color palette, or Renoir may have had, like, it was really fun. So I just sort of, I'm looking at it from the perspective of language. I'm looking at it from the perspective of sense. And Anuj wants to say something.
Yeah, just because you said that your mom sort of like has this thing where she sort of deduced what kind of visual impairment these people may have had at some point at their given the color palette and everything. For a more accessible example of that, Christopher Nolan is colorblind. Like, so
Hmm.
he has a more blue-green perception, which is why his movies look the way they do. Even
Hmm.
the flames in his movies are blue.
Hmm.
And I always thought, like, I think Tenet is the first time I saw the color yellow in his films,
Hmm.
and I
Right,
am not
yeah.
making that up.
But
And I was
I'm
like, what if?
sure he must be a director, but his AD and his those guys play a larger role, no? Like the cinematographer and all would have come in with colors.
Yeah, of course. There is a color palette that's larger than just blue,
Hmm.
and the cinematographer might have a lot more to do with it. But it's just
Hmm.
an observation that I thought was
No, it's cool
relevant in a sense,
for sure.
because I think the first time I saw him, it was just black and white. What was that movie that Gajini copied? Guy Pearce
Oh
is in
yeah,
it.
Memento. Memento.
Memento. Yeah, so Memento was just black and white, and after that, the Dark Knight series did not have yellow until the last hour of the last movie.
Oh man,
So
Gajini.
yeah, so I always thought if that's consequential, I mean, also the fact that there's always a dead wife, but that's a completely different discussion. Why why does Christopher Nolan only direct like characters with dead wives? I don't understand. Anyway, sorry, Aditi, you were saying like basically how your
So yeah,
experience might dictate the way you create aesthetic. Yeah.
yeah, your experience might dictate the way you think about aesthetic. They might dictate the way you define aesthetic to a certain extent. Um, and I feel like at this point, just to sort of circle back with history, because I feel like at times, me sort of studying history taints my experience of certain things in some way, or my understanding of like certain words in some way. If you sort of like do a full circle, I just feel like at this point, the meaning of the word is much more associated to experience than anything else, you know, than anything else that I have spoken about so far.
Yeah, no, I think you hit the nail when you said that your experiences define what the meaning of aesthetic is to you.
I mean,
And
I think it's a running. Go ahead. Did you have a thought that you had to complete?
no, all good. Go ahead.
Okay, so I think this is a running gag on the podcast as well. I think I did 2 episodes about it, uh, where the entire uh, way we come towards the understanding of perception is that you're stuck behind the wall of perception, and objective reality is like somewhere out there, out of your reach, and all you have is five senses to guide you as to an approximation of what it may be. But again, I can only come to that because of the way I think through visualization, like just the way I'm wired. So your experience will dictate the way you perceive everything, and aesthetic
Being one of
is the
them.
philosophy of perception, as I mean I've come to understand it throughout this podcast. So
Yeah.
um, I think it also goes into a segue as to the because the second leg of this podcast is philosophy. The important part where like Aditi said, the cave paintings, why use that medium to communicate, and like you pointed out with the Ashoka stupas and statues, that like why use this sculpture to spread religion. So in all cases, aesthetic, when it's deliberately done, at least when it's deliberately done, is to communicate something. And I want to know that beyond language, why use visual cues like as a part of communication like because it says something about a thought in a certain time as well. So I just want to get into why, what is it about aesthetic that helps us communicate so efficiently, and beyond communication, how do you use the philosophical study of aesthetics in real life?
Going back to when you said why use a cave painting, or why use a stupa, why use sculpture. Um, I just want to like sort of weigh into that and say that maybe because that's all we can sort of, that's what survived. Like I just feel like there may be like vocal sort of communication, there may have been performative communication, but that is uh, probably wasn't very easy to record.
Hmm.
So this was just sort of easily recorded, and so we know about it. I think there is not much more to you know
Inquire into this.
yeah, into that. It's very
Yeah.
sort of, it's quite straightforward. That's what survived. A building survived, a painting survived, a sculpture survived.
Yeah.
Some years from now, a podcast will survive, and that will become sort of, that
Yeah.
it's as simple
It's
as that.
simple.
Is what I will. Yeah.
Hmm.
I agree.
What?
And I think materials in its anything with materiality is more simpler to conserve. So that's why, like, you know about the Mesopotamian civilization because of the pots. Because pots
Hmm.
do not disintegrate easily. As in
Mhm.
ceramics doesn't disintegrate so easily. So I agree. I think it's simplistic to say.
Interesting
Yeah.
that you put it that way because, like, that should have occurred to me when I was doing the time capsules episode. Uh, because, like, that's sort of what it is, like something that is deliberately kept for survival. But most of the time capsules that we read history through are like not deliberately left behind.
Hmm.
They're just things that people did, and then it had like this chain effect that resulted in survival of certain things.
Hmm.
Um, and while I was phrasing the question, I sort of thought about it because I can't stop thinking about memes. That most aesthetic is just a meme that's strong.
That's
Also, I mean, I'll explain that statement later, but like, also, I want to unpack how um, Indian artists are looked as artisans by the West. And this is something that me and Aditi have complained about before in like
Uh,
private text. But the reason I bring that up is because even when I think about art that is 21 centuries old from history that is local, it comes up in the context of a kingdom and in the context of a religious
hmm.
expansion. And the reason I say memes is because memes by Richard Dawkins's uh, definition are basically just non-genetic tropes that travel from generation to generation. So it's viral marketing essentially, an
Hmm.
idea that sticks. That's basically a meme.
Hmm.
And Buddhism, by that logic, becomes one of the strongest memes because it spreads so fast and it spreads so well.
Yeah, I feel
And
you.
I feel like if by survival of an idea basis, those stupas become some of the strongest memes from the time.
Interesting way to
And
look at it for sure.
yeah, so I'm sort of blown away by the fact that physical existence of a meme is a thing because I thought that was the cringiest thing that one can do. But turns out it just expands your lifetime.
yeah. Oh,
That's also
yeah.
if you
No.
So
want to
anyway,
label it that, no? I mean,
I'm sorry.
a lot of all of this goes into labeling, and a lot of all of this goes into intellectualizing this stuff by giving it names and terms and stuff, which I know we do to simplify conversation. But labeling in itself creates unnecessary divisions, I think, for
Uh,
for conversations like this that have the essence in uh, art or philosophy or experiences. It's difficult to put clear cut label.
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
No, I think it just makes it easier for the thought to sort of move through generations.
Mm.
I guess just like survive longer. That's what it helps. Like these
Mm.
sort of like intellectualizations. Like because that's what I. It's so annoying because that's what I have to. Matlab I like doing. That's what I do, and I have to write. Right.
Mm.
I have to write very objectively about something that I am experiencing. Like if I say, for
Yeah.
example, sincerely, one of the first things that was taught to me when I was like studying history of art was how to write objectively about something that is as subjective as, say, uh, concept art or you know just abstract
Color
art.
or
It's just,
something.
yeah, like
Mm.
just color. And how do you write it objectively? Like of course through training and all you learn how to do it, but when you do it enough you sort of realize that this is so that someone can read it. It is not for you. Your experience is your own experience,
Yeah.
and that's the only way you can sanely write about these things, I feel. Otherwise, it just sort of, it
It
makes
blurs
you become,
boundaries.
it
Yeah.
makes you become very desensitized towards things that you essentially would have otherwise enjoyed experiencing,
Mm.
so the only way to go forward with it is to understand that you're using these labels to just record, and for someone else's ease, and not for your own experience. And even when people read about art, I
Mm.
feel like they should keep this in mind, that this is like it's a record more than when you're reading an art historian. It is a record of their thoughts combined with what they experience in the most objective form they could possibly be. This does
Yeah.
not have to, of course, to a certain extent, it will influence your experience, but this is not the promotion of a
Intended to
certain
do
type of.
that.
Yeah, yeah, correct, correct.
No,
Yeah,
that's
sorry,
super
Anuj.
cool.
Nothing. It's just interesting that the way Himanshi sort of put it segues into another part of like the philosophy segment of this podcast that I wanted to get into. Have both of you seen Contrapoints by any chance?
What is
Okay,
it?
Contrapoints is a she is a philosopher, like an ex-philosopher. I think she has a PhD in philosophy. But she runs a YouTube channel, a very successful one and a really good one. I highly encourage that you check it out. She sort of made uh, a video titled "Aesthetic,"
Mm-hmm.
and I watched it a while ago. And in that, she sort of brings up gender and aesthetics because she's a trans woman,
Mm.
and she sort of uses the argument of aesthetics that are made against her in philosophy as to how performance of gender, like, because this is like walking right into the problems with labels that you talked about,
Mm.
that a certain so she talks about how a certain aesthetic is masculine and certain aesthetic is feminine, and how those labels are the ones that we must adhere to get recognition from society,
Mm.
and that in turn also facilitates our oppression as whatever a cis woman or a trans male or a trans woman or a trans man.
That's what I mean when, especially when Aditi said that labels help for record. That makes so much sense because it's
Hmm.
like if it's made for the intention of objective recording, then that's amazing. But the way that labels like have a negative connotation is when it kind of creates separation, creates segregation, creates division. And as soon as it creates division, it's a problem because you're not seeing
Right.
it holistically. You're seeing it in a narrow dimension.
No, I agree completely. Like, I feel like this is what we sort of need to. Uh, it's critical thinking, right? When you're
Mm,
reading something and when you're truly trying to analyze it or think about it,
mm,
uh, um, because most of what you learn comes from reading at this point. Eventually,
mm,
it will come from sort of, media like this, like a pod or videos and things like that.
mm,
When you sort of take in someone's sort of record of certain things, it is very important that people know that you're taking in someone's record, and
mm,
that is it. That does not have to, and this whole idea of like, this is why sometimes I really don't like writing about. So I hate writing about things that I truly enjoy. uh, I feel like it sort of makes it so difficult for me,
to detach.
not just to detach, to also sort of break it down, because breaking it down makes it so, it just sucks the fun out of it when you have to, boil certain experiences down, like
Yeah.
uh, a certain performance, a certain artwork, like certain things I just don't touch. I just don't write about. So
Like you're
I've
straining
had,
the juice, and you're like, let me take
yeah,
all the pulp out separately and look at it.
yeah, correct. Yeah. So I completely understand what you're saying. And I feel like this whole, it feeds into the idea of labels used for segregation more than labels used for just just ease of communication. Like,
Exactly. Because then labeling becomes subjective more than objective, and
yeah,
that's where I have an issue. That's my only issue.
yeah.
Is that as
No,
soon as
it is a very important issue to have. I feel like it's sort of it's why most of the world issues are happening right now is because of that. Like I just also not to say like see it's I feel like it's a very thin line to cross. I feel like on some level you need to understand what certain labels are because they have social connotations, they have historical connotations, they have, and you
yeah,
will understand a person's experience by the labels that they carry in whatever way they carry it. So,
mm,
anyone with any amount of privilege saying, I don't see labels, is a way of sort of, washing their hands
mm,
off of responsibility and accountability. So, on some level, you need to sort of understand where some of these things come from.
okay.
But at the same time, your experience need not be, you
As-
know,
Correct. Yeah, it need not be completely dictated by the labels. You have to
correct.
be able to look at it and be like, that's just a label. For example, this lady who you're talking about, who's a trans woman, talking about the effect of aesthetic to different genders, etc. It's like if we label it, okay, purple is a color that often connotates to homosexuality. You have to look at it as an objective reality that a label, but that does not need to associate with every single individual, does not need to associate with every single thing that you connect to. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense.
yeah. So basically, when label becomes stereotype, that's when the whole issue
And this,
starts.
imagine, we're talking about this only in terms of aesthetic, but this is political, religious,
Yeah,
it's larger level
like
issues.
like I said, world issues. No,
Yeah.
it's like everything that is wrong with the world right now, which is so much. It like boils down to this. Boils down to how you understand.
Associate.
Yeah, understand labels. How you take responsibility for some of them. Like for some of us, there is also an element of yes, certain things that I come from as a privileged person uh, comes because my ancestors set a certain label for a
Hmm.
certain sort of form of oppression. Um, so to understand that also becomes important, and in that moment it was not recording. In that moment, it was a tool for oppression, uh, and to sort of bear responsibility for that and make sure that you hold yourself accountable for that is also very important. Is what I think.
Which
Uh,
circles back to his initial question. Sorry, Anu, just wrapping up this point. To
Go
his
ahead.
to his initial subject about the philosophy of aesthetic is that without actually inquiring into these levels of depth when it comes to anything, let it be aesthetic or let it be environmental science, whatever, just inquiring into this level will allow you to truly understand the value of what aesthetic is. Otherwise, it's again a superficial know-how.
right. Yeah.
Uh, I mean, I just wanted to add to what Aditi was saying about how uh, like completely running away from labels, sort of like is like evading responsibility.
Hmm.
Is one of the senses like again, because my brain only works on memes. One of the memes I saw recently was Brahmins in the Vedic era is like our Sanskrit, like my Sanskrit, and then today it's our Sanskrit. And it was interesting because for a very long time nobody thought of arguing. Well, you stopped us from saying it. It was your language. There's a certain way a Brahmin should sound in like 300 BC to like what 100 maybe 50 years ago, even today.
Hmm.
And then there's a certain way that everybody else should sound like,
Mm.
depending on their position in society based on caste, which is a horrible system. We don't endorse that. In
Hmm.
case Wall Street Journal. Anyway, so that sort of also leads into what aesthetic represents in today's understanding of history and what the history actually was.
Mm.
So in that sense, as labels become important, they're sort of both the problem and the solution in
Ooh.
that
Right.
way.
Also, to add to this is I don't know if you read what I had sent you earlier today. As a follow up to this question, can we also discuss how then these labels play an important role in validation and how the work that you eventually create need these labels to kind of support and stay alive in this world?
Like I said, no, you want it to be recorded, it has to come under some form of like organization, right? So if you
Structure.
need
Yeah.
something to survive longer, it needs to fall under something. Hence, making that something, which in this case is labeled, a form of validation, uh, and hence making them important to you, even if you feel like you're agnostic towards it, or you don't want to abide by them. There is a very cool, I think it was Sartre, I don't remember, but there's this very cool this thing about how piece essay about how non-political art is extremely political in itself, because of the privilege certain artists have of being able to be non-political. It's not,
That's
being
very interesting. Yeah.
yeah, and that is true for a lot of what is happening right now. Also, I feel like, calling something like I don't fall under any label, or I don't believe I'm colorblind, I'm caste blind. All of this is just like, a way of ignoring the issue.
Like
And
all those people, this might be slightly leaning towards a political conversation, but all those people leaning towards all lives matter when the Black Lives Matter situation was going on,
uh,
you know?
yeah, exactly. That is what, like, yes, Anuj.
Uh, so sort of that you bring up privilege of being apolitical in a political world. Um, Interestingly, it leads back to the privilege of being apolitical in a political world, sort of leads back to my class of jurisprudence and social contract theory, that because your your ability to
Correct.
do apolitical art is facilitated by the politics of it. You gave up your ability or your autonomy to sort of rebel against the state or take up a weapon and kill somebody, and in exchange the state provided you with
Right.
the safety to build an institution and practice art.
Yeah.
Like you could dedicate
Yeah.
resources to that.
Yeah.
So there has never been
Good one.
apolitical art, because
This comes from a very
all
shitty movie. I don't
art
really
has been
like the movie, but
facilitated by the
there's this
politics of its
line is
time.
like all art is political, otherwise it's decoration. Like, it stuck with me.
Are it's from this movie Party from
No, no.
1875.
Even decoration is
No,
political.
it's from this movie called Anonymous, which I'm like. So my guilty pleasure is watching historical dramas, because it's like if a doctor watches Scrubs, like it's kind of like
Yeah.
that for me.
It's like
And
you're creating your own echo chamber and you're like, wow, 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 wow.
yeah, so I really like watching historical drama, mostly to like just like haha, so inaccurate. I like doing that. But anyway, uh, yeah, so I agree with you, Anuj. And this whole apolitical art sort of essay came from Arts for Art's Sake, which is like a French movement, and there have been multiple events in European history which sort of rebels against this. So in the 18s, there was something called the British Black Arts movements in England,
Mm.
uh, which happened because the way fine arts were taught in England were very sort of ethnicity agnostic, and it just taught you techniques and skill more than just more than a mode of self-expression, and a lot of like the black over here means people of color at large. So a lot of like South Asian diaspora in England also joined this movement, and
Mm.
it sort of was this whole was this whole cultural shift where uh, the people who are first generation, second generation immigrants in the UK were sort of like, we don't have the privilege to just make art because uh, we have these experiences, we come from these situations, and that is why we are in art school. And it was also sort of co-linked with a lot of why arts education or humanities education in the UK is uh, pursued by white upper class people, and then how do you sort of shift that? Like even now for that matter, like it's very rare if you could, like I was the only person in my entire building studying history of art who was a person like who was South Asian. uh, and I went to quite like a big university which calls itself international. This whole idea of uh, you know um,
It's also Maslow's pyramid discussion, no?
yeah.
Like, yeah, if you are, but this goes down to like,
Sort of, yeah.
are you in that sector where you think you have the time slash bandwidth slash all needs fulfilled to even engage intellectually or not intellectually in this conversation?
We want to think of it like that. I feel like it's such an easy solution to think of it like that. कि, oh,
It's,
हमने अभी तक रोटी कपड़ा मकान ही नहीं किया है. Like so let us become doctors first and engineers first, and then we'll think about it. It's very easy to think of it like that, but it also comes from a very, oh, here you are allowed to do this. It historically it comes from you are allowed to be an artist, or you are allowed to pursue a certain kind of, you're allowed to do theater, things like that. It comes from that. And it this really irritates me so much. But Anuj knows this. Anuj once like showed me a meme and asked me a question, and I went into a whole rant about how this is a thing in like museums across the world, like across the global west. This is how, like, I think the meme was like, you have a room full of works by a particular Western artist, and you have a wall which is like centuries of work done by someone from, say, African diaspora or Middle Eastern diaspora or South Asian diaspora. It's just
yeah.
like one wall versus an entire room. And even that wall is stolen. Like, oh, it irritates me so much. Sorry, I'm going to pass this on to someone else before I rant.
I mean, because you brought that up, and also something that came up while we were saying this, that like an institution needs to recognize, um, like, so, something for it to be recorded as history, as historical art somewhere. Interestingly, I was reading Arthur Danto recently because I wanted to prepare for this episode, and he introduced me to something called institutional theory of art,
Yes,
where the literal
yes,
definition of art is whatever the
yes.
institute says the art is.
But any structure, any institution,
And
any grid format will have this as a problem, no? No matter what it
Yeah,
is.
yeah. Like,
yeah, of course,
no,
of
no.
course.
No, I'm just telling you.
The problem
Like,
is,
this
go
is
ahead.
my
I'm sorry.
this is my whole sort of philosophical tug of war with my own profession all the time. Like, it comes from so much like, no, I do not believe in this, but this is what my textbook tells me. So, like, what do I do to like take this forward and not, this is why I end up writing only two pieces in a year, because most of the time I'm just like fighting with myself. I'm just
But
like, no, no,
you eventually just take the definition that they give you as a baseline to build your own, no? Or anything.
no, no. I feel like at times that doesn't really help, because the definite, like this definition of art from institution bit is something that it's one of many different definitions of art. But it is so off my radar that I will never even consider like building from it. Like, why would I? I don't. There is no part of me that relates to that. There is no part of me that understands that. Yes, Anuj.
No, then I was just like, then if that's the case, if you do not relate to this definition of it of art by this institution, you still you still choose your own. No, you end up making your own.
That, again, so that's what I'm saying. It's a philosophical tug of war that happens all the time. It's like you cannot have a thought and not debate it. Like that's how writing has been for me for the last 5 years. Just like have a thought, debate it multiple times over 6 months, write one paragraph, repeat for 6 more months. This is my whole sort of career at this point of time.
Uh, anyway, the reason I bring up the institutional theory of art, because, like you said, the internal debate. Like when I read it, it genuinely pissed me off. And then I was like, wait,
That's how everything
that's how we
works.
do legal
That's how
Yeah.
everything
consensus.
works. Yeah,
Like something's law because everyone
everything is
agreed.
imagined, Anuj.
Yeah, that's how everything works. And I was
Yeah.
like,
Everything is
I've
imagined.
walked myself
This
into
is
a
what
corner.
Sapiens did to me. I read Sapiens like 3 times, and like the first time I read it, I was like, "What? Everything is imagined. This is not like I had a whole existential crisis for 2 weeks, and then I had to
I
pick up the
mean,
book again."
these labels that we make also is just language that's made. It's all we want to enter
Sapiens,
this phase of this conversation where it's kind of like everything can be redundant or absolutely fantastical. You decide which direction this is going to take.
can be nahi. Himanshi is everything is.
I mean, if you say your work involves you to be analytical, like your work, Aditi, requires you to use thought to critique to make. Okay, just imagine the diabolicalness in that, because a thought cannot exist in a non-binary form. It exists in binary form, which means you will have a point to oppose and a point to support, no matter what
No,
the thought is.
no. So see, I like that. I have through some years and some practice, I have come to a point where I do not become so binary. It is when it becomes that binary is when you have opinions and subjective sort of thought in history writing, for that matter,
And conflict, yeah.
and conflict. It becomes very important for any kind, and this is why I sort of there are not a lot of history writers that I like because of this, because it comes from this sort of either or perspective.
Hmm.
Because at the end of the day, I feel like it takes a lot of mental, at times even emotional effort to reach a point where you have two ends of a spectrum and you try to understand the spectrum as opposed to understanding the like ends of it, and like have them fight each other in your brain and getting whole other level of critical thinking, which honestly we are not really taught. Like it is something that comes only from practice. It is not something that is inherent,
Yeah.
and that practice needs to be done quite often for you to sort of
Wrap your head around.
reach, even like,
Yeah.
yeah, just like even when you do things like reading the news or which I don't even know how to deal with that anymore, but if you're reading the news and you it's not, it's never fully sahi, fully galat. It's not that. You will have to, like, you will have ethical dilemmas about known to you. It is not abnormal for you to go through. You will go through a process of looking back at your political decisions, looking at your politics, looking back at your philosophies when you read news, and that is what is happening to a lot of people right now, and they don't know how to deal with it.
That
Aditi,
this binary thing is going to exist unless you practice
um,
it really hard to
Yeah,
get
you
out of
have
it.
to very, yeah. So like I was saying that when you read, look at it from the perspective of you going through news right now. Okay,
Hmm.
anyone, all of us are sort of like a little overwhelmed with the like news happening right now. And I was having a conversation about this with my partner, where both of us were like, all of this always happened. It is not like, this is
Hmm.
not new. we knew all of these things existed. We have the time and space to take it in at this point of time. So we don't know how to take it in, because whenever you take in so much information at the same point of time, you have ethical dilemmas, which is very, very normal to have. Like you have like you go through your own sense of politics, your own sense of philosophy, your own sort of ethics and things like that.
Yeah, you have to
It is
question all of that again.
yeah,
Yeah.
it is very natural that this happens to you, and it takes, yes, it does take a certain amount of emotional toll, but it is important for all of us to go through that. I feel
To
like
evolve.
that,
Yeah.
yeah, not just to evolve, just to sort of not let anything fool you, not let uh, not let at this point, even to not let propaganda get to you, to understand what news is important and what is not to you, to draw a line for your own mental health, things like that. Just
Raw
because
loin. Sorry, I had
loin,
to.
draw, draw a line. I mean, draw a loin also. That's fine. Yeah.
And I think that's all we have for today. Thank you for making time for this, guys.
Thanks.
No, it was good fun. Thank you.
Thank you, Himanshi and Aditi, for being on this podcast and helping our audience understand aesthetic, and saving me the time for more than enough research, and also saving my audience from my regular voice. Uh, Moving on, I would like to issue a special thank you to Purva Dot to make the cover for this podcast episode and the thumbnail potentially. And that's it. If you think the content is worth it, please, please, please support us on Patreon. I could really use some support, and subscribe to me on YouTube, and follow us on Spotify, Google, whatever you have, and other social media, which is Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. There is meme content over there. If you like meme content all together, please go check that out. And yeah, have a nice